The first sign something was wrong came in the form of diesel exhaust hanging in the afternoon air. Sarah Chen pulled into her driveway after 3 days visiting her sister upstate, and the smell hit her before she'd even turned off the engine. Heavy machinery, fresh earth, the particular chemical tang of disturbed soil mixed with hydraulic fluid. She sat in the car for a moment, windows down, trying to place what she was sensing. Her property backed onto the HOA common area, a stretch of maintained lawn that separated her lot from the retention pond the neighborhood shared. Maintenance happened there occasionally, mowing, seasonal mulching. But this was different. This was construction-grade disruption. Sarah grabbed her phone and walked around the side of her house. The excavator sat idle in what used to be the flat stretch of grass between her fence line and the tree she'd planted 2 springs ago. A small oak, maybe 12 feet tall now, its leaves just beginning to turn. 20 feet beyond it, where her property sloped gently toward the common area, someone had carved an enormous hole into the ground. Not a hole, a basin, deliberate, shaped. The earth piled in neat berms on either side. She stood at her back fence and stared. The excavation was maybe 40 feet across, 8 feet deep at the center, with graduated shelves cut into the sides. The kind of thing you'd see in a landscaping magazine. Decorative, expensive, completely unauthorized. Her property. She knew it was her property because she'd had it surveyed 18 months ago when she'd installed the fence. The survey stakes were still there, faded orange plastic caps marking the corners. The basin sat squarely between them, 15 feet inside her lot line. Sarah pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Wide shots showing the excavator and the disturbed earth. Close-ups of the survey markers, the tree line in the background that marked the actual common area, a good 30 feet beyond where the digging had occurred. A truck door slammed somewhere behind her. She turned to see a man in a contractor's vest, walking across the common area lawn, clipboard in hand. He waved. "Afternoon," he called. "You're the homeowner here?" "I am." He gestured at the excavation with visible pride. "Coming along nice, right? Should have the liner in by Thursday. Water feature installed by the weekend. Real showcase piece." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Who authorized this? The contractor blinked. The HOA got the work order right here. He tapped his clipboard. Decorative pond, native plantings, the whole 9 yards. Part of the common area beautification project. This isn't the common area. He frowned, glanced at the hole, then back at her. "Ma'am, I'm just going off the site plan they gave me. They said this whole section is my property. I have a survey. I have a fence. You're standing on my land right now." The contractor's expression shifted. Not defensive yet, just the beginning awareness that something had gone wrong in a way that wasn't his fault, but was definitely going to become his problem. "I'm going to need to make a call," he said. Sarah nodded. "You do that, and while you're at it, you can tell whoever hired you that they've got until tomorrow morning to explain how they thought it was acceptable to excavate my property without asking." She walked back to her house, phone still in her hand, photos already uploading to cloud storage. Behind her, she could hear the contractor on his radio, his voice carrying across the torn earth, the words, property line, and survey, and we might have a situation, drifting through the diesel-scented air. The pond they'd dug gleamed dully in the late sun, raw earth exposed like a wound. It wouldn't be there long. The first sign was the sound, a low mechanical rumble that didn't belong in a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah Chen had been working from home, half focused on a spreadsheet, when the noise pulled her attention to the window. She saw nothing from the kitchen, so she moved to the back door. What she found in her yard made no sense. A backhoe sat idling near the property line, its yellow paint bright against the grass. 2 men in high-visibility vests stood beside a gouged section of earth, one pointing toward her fence line, while the other consulted a clipboard. Behind them, where her lawn had been flat and unremarkable that morning, now gaped a crater roughly 15 feet across and at least 4 feet deep. Mounds of displaced soil formed dark hills around the perimeter. Sarah stepped outside. The air smelled of diesel and torn earth. "Excuse me," she called, walking toward them. "What's going on here?" The man with the clipboard looked up, surprised to see her. "HOA Pond Project, ma'am. Should be wrapped up by end of week." "Pond Project." Sarah repeated the words slowly, trying to make them connect to anything she'd been told. "On my property." "Common area enhancement," the man said, tapping his clipboard. "Board approved it last month. Decorative water feature for the neighborhood." Sarah looked at the hole again. It sat a good 20 feet inside her fence line, well past the drainage easement that ran along the back edge of the development. She'd walked this yard 100 times, knew exactly where her lot ended and the HOA's maintenance responsibility began. "This isn't common area," she said. "This is my yard." The clipboard man frowned. "We were given this location by the property manager. I've got the work order right here." He turned the clipboard toward her. Sarah scanned the document, a standard contractor authorization form with the HOA's letterhead, a vague description of pond installation per board directive, and a hand-drawn map that showed a rectangle labeled installation site, with no actual survey markers or lot numbers. "Who gave you access to my property?" Sarah asked. "Nobody gave us access. Gate was open. We came through." He gestured toward the side yard. "Look, lady, we're just doing the job we were hired for. You've got questions, take it up with your HOA." Sarah pulled out her phone and photographed the excavation from multiple angles. The hole itself, the equipment, the piles of dirt, the men standing beside their work. She made sure to capture the fence line in the background, the clear distance between the common area and where they dug. "You need to stop," she said. "Right now. This is private property and nobody authorized you to be here." The second worker, who'd been silent until now, exchanged a glance with his partner. "We've got 3 more days scheduled on this job." "Not on my land, you don't." Sarah walked back inside and went straight to her filing cabinet. The property survey sat in a folder marked House Documents, exactly where it had been since closing. She pulled it out and unfolded the large sheet, tracing the boundary lines with her finger. The measurements were precise, the corners marked with iron pins that had been verified during inspection. The pond sat entirely within her lot, not close to the line, well inside it. She took photos of the survey, then called the HOA management company. The phone rang 4 times before rolling to voicemail. She left a message, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. Through the window, she watched the workers pack up their equipment. The backhoe's engine coughed to silence. They drove away, leaving the torn earth and the gaping hole behind. Sarah looked at the excavation, then at the survey in her hands, then back at the hole. She made another call. The survey documents sat on the kitchen table like evidence at a trial. Thick, cream-colored paper with the county seal embossed in the corner. The homeowner had pulled them from the filing cabinet within an hour of discovering the pond, hands still shaking with the particular fury that comes from finding your property violated. The lines were unambiguous. Lot 47, Parcel 18-4402-023. The eastern boundary ran 38 feet past where the pond now sat, a gaping wound in earth that belonged to no one but them. The HOA hadn't made a close call or a reasonable mistake. They had crossed into private property by the length of a school bus. But anger without proof is just noise. The homeowner knew this, knew that the HOA would claim confusion, would produce their own maps, would suggest that boundaries had always been unclear in this section of the development. They would deploy the institutional language of reasonable doubt, of good faith errors, of community benefit outweighing individual inconvenience. So the homeowner called the surveyor whose name appeared on the original plat, a man named Caldwell, who had been marking property lines in this county for 30 years, and whose reputation for precision was the kind you didn't argue with. He arrived the next morning in a truck that had seen weather. No clipboard assistant, no unnecessary conversation. Just a man who understood that land doesn't lie, even when people do. The homeowner watched him work from the kitchen window. Caldwell moved with the economy of someone who had performed this exact sequence of actions thousands of times. Transit set up on the concrete benchmark at the street corner. Measurements taken from the iron pins that marked the lot corners, pins that had been driven into ground before the first foundation was poured in this development. It took him 40 minutes. When he knocked on the door, he was holding a laser distance measurer and a tablet with the original survey overlaid on a satellite image. "The pond's on your lot," he said. Not a question, not an opinion, a statement of measurable fact. Centered about 22 feet inside your eastern boundary. Whoever authorized this either didn't check or didn't care. The homeowner asked him to put it in writing. Caldwell nodded once. "I'll have a certified boundary verification to you by end of business today. If this goes legal, it'll hold up. The pins don't move. The measurements don't change. This isn't a gray area." After he left, the homeowner walked the boundary line themselves. Caldwell had marked it with orange flags every 10 feet, a bright line of proof that cut through whatever narrative the HOA might try to construct. The pond sat wholly within that line, an intrusion so clear that even without the surveyor's certification, anyone with eyes could see the violation. But eyes weren't enough. Not with an HOA that had already demonstrated its willingness to act without permission. The homeowner needed documentation that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be reinterpreted, couldn't be buried under committee double talk. The certification arrived by email at 4:30 that afternoon. 3 pages. Caldwell's signature and seal on every one. Measurements cross-referenced to the county recorder's office. Photographs of the iron pins with GPS coordinates. A statement in plain language that left no room for interpretation. The excavated pond feature is located entirely within the boundaries of Lot 47, as recorded in Plat Book 89, page 14, and constitutes an unauthorized improvement to private property. The homeowner printed 4 copies. 1 for their records. 1 for the attorney they would call if this went further than it needed to. 1 for the HOA board, though they wouldn't receive it until after the next step was complete. And 1 to hand to the excavation company, so they would know exactly what they were undoing, and why no one could claim confusion when the work was done. The property survey sat on the kitchen table, its precise lines and measurements transforming what had been a violation into documented trespass. 3 separate confirmations now existed: the original deed, the county assessor's plat map, and the surveyor's fresh stakes driven into ground that belonged to no one but him. The pond, with its decorative rocks and carefully sloped edges, occupied 17 feet of private property. He photographed everything. The survey stakes with their bright orange caps, the pond itself from 4 angles, the disturbed earth where the HOA's contractors had tracked mud across his lawn, the small decorative bridge they'd installed, its wooden plank still smelling of fresh stain. Each image was time-stamped, geotagged, saved to 3 separate locations. Then he opened his phone and started making calls. The first excavation company could start in 2 weeks. The second had a project running long, maybe 10 days. The third answered on the second ring and said they had a cancellation tomorrow if he could provide site access by 7 a.m. "How big's the pond?" the dispatcher asked. "Maybe 20 by 15, 4 feet deep at the center. We can have that filled by noon. You want it graded level or returned to original contour?" "Original contour. I want it like nothing was ever there." "That'll cost extra for the grading work." "I don't care what it costs." He heard keys clicking on the other end. "You'll need fill dirt. We can source that, but it adds to the timeline." "How much longer?" "Day and a half total. We fill it tomorrow, grade and seed the day after." "Do it." The contract arrived by email 6 minutes later. He signed it electronically, authorized the payment, and forwarded the confirmation to his own attorney with a brief note. Remediation begins tomorrow. HOA was notified 0 times, same as they notified me. His lawyer called back within the hour. You're sure about the boundary? 3 confirmations, it's not even close. And you're not giving them warning. They didn't give me warning. A pause. They're going to lose their minds. They should have checked the property lines. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying be prepared for them to claim you're destroying HOA improvements on my land that they built without permission. I know. I'm just telling you how they'll frame it. Papers rustled in the background. Make sure your contractor documents everything, before, during, after, and keep those survey results somewhere safe. Already done. Good. Call me when it's finished. He spent the rest of the evening preparing the site. The decorative bridge came apart easily, just 8 bolts holding it to concrete footings the contractors had poured directly into his soil. He stacked the lumber against his fence. The rocks they'd arranged around the pond's edge went into a wheelbarrow, then into a pile near the property line. Not on HOA common ground, just near it, visible. By the time the sun set, the pond sat exposed and empty of ornament. Just a hole in the ground with a thin skin of water at the bottom from the afternoon's rain. It looked exactly like what it was, an unauthorized excavation on private property. He set his alarm for 6:30. The excavators would arrive at 7, and he wanted to be outside when they pulled up. Wanted to see the equipment roll onto his driveway. Watch the first bucket of filled dirt drop into the space where the HOA had decided his property rights didn't matter. They'd made an assumption. A costly one. Tomorrow, he'd correct it. The excavator arrived at dawn, its yellow bulk rolling off the flatbed with a hydraulic hiss that carried across the quiet street. Tom had made the call 16 hours earlier, standing in his driveway with his phone in one hand and the surveyor's report in the other, watching the last of the daylight fade over the gaping hole that shouldn't exist. The operator climbed down from the cab, a man in his 50s, with the deliberate movements of someone who'd spent decades reading land. He walked the perimeter of the pond without speaking, occasionally crouching to examine the excavated soil piled in neat berms along the eastern edge. They did clean work, he said, finally. Professional crew, probably cost them $12,000–15,000. Tom didn't respond. The number meant nothing except as a measure of how committed the HOA had been to their mistake. You want it exactly as it was, or just filled and graded? Exactly as it was. The operator nodded once. 6 hours, maybe 7. I'll need to compact in layers or you'll have settling problems come spring. By 8 o'clock, the machine was moving. The pond had been roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest point, excavated to a depth of 4 feet, with sloped sides that suggested someone had actually consulted a landscaping guide. Decorative river stone lined the bottom. Another expense, another detail that made the trespass feel more deliberate. The excavator's bucket bit into the soil berms first, scooping and pivoting, dumping load after load back into the cavity. The riverstone disappeared beneath brown earth. The careful grading work vanished. Each bucket load was a reversal, an erasure, the land slowly rising back toward level. Tom watched from the driveway. He'd taken the day off work, called in without explanation, because he needed to see this through from beginning to end, needed to watch every cubic yard of soil return to where it belonged. At 9:30, Carolyn appeared at the property line. She stood perfectly still, one hand raised to shade her eyes, watching the excavator work. She didn't cross onto his property, didn't call out, just stood there as the pond continued to disappear, her expression unreadable at this distance. The operator worked methodically, pausing every 40 minutes to climb down and check the grade with a laser level he'd mounted on a tripod. The compaction happened in stages: fill, grade, compact, repeat. The machine's weight alone wasn't enough. He used a plate compactor for the final layers, walking behind it in careful passes that overlapped like roofing shingles. By noon, the pond was gone. What remained was a patch of disturbed earth, darker than the surrounding lawn, slightly lower than grade but within tolerance. The operator spent another hour on final grading, feathering the edges where new met old, creating a transition gradual enough that settling wouldn't create a visible depression. "You'll want to oversee this in about 2 weeks," he said, coiling hydraulic lines. "Let it settle, then add topsoil and seed. By next spring, you won't be able to tell anything happened here." Tom paid him in cash, the bills counted out against the excavator's warm hood. The operator didn't ask questions about why someone would fill in a professionally installed pond less than a week after construction. He'd seen enough property disputes to recognize one when it was staring him in the face. The flatbed pulled away at 2 o'clock. Tom stood in his yard, looking at the patch of raw earth where the pond had been. 6 hours to undo what had probably taken 2 days to create. The math felt appropriate somehow. Swift enough to make the point, thorough enough to erase the presumption completely. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about this." He deleted it without responding. There was nothing to talk about. The land was his. The pond was gone. The message had been delivered in the most unambiguous language possible. Dirt and diesel, and the sound of an engine that didn't stop until the mistake was corrected. The law doesn't care about good intentions when someone digs on your property without permission. It doesn't matter if the HOA thought they were improving the neighborhood, believed the land was theirs, or simply didn't bother to check. The moment their contractors drove equipment onto private property and broke ground, they committed trespass. And the legal framework surrounding that violation is remarkably clear. Trespass to land occurs when someone intentionally enters property owned by another without authorization. The key word is intentional. The HOA made a deliberate choice to excavate. Whether they knew it was private property is legally irrelevant. Mistake doesn't erase the trespass. Ignorance of boundary lines doesn't create a defense. The property owner's rights in this situation are absolute. No one, not a neighbor, not a corporation, not a homeowners association, has authority to alter, excavate, or construct on private land without the owner's explicit consent. HOA membership doesn't grant blanket easements. Paying dues doesn't convey construction rights. Serving on the board doesn't authorize entry onto lots the association doesn't own. When the homeowner discovered the unauthorized pond, they held every legal advantage. They could have pursued damages for trespass. They could have filed for injunctive relief. They could have demanded the HOA restore the property at the association's expense, then sued for any deficiency in the restoration work. Instead, they chose the most direct remedy available, self-help restoration, and the law fully supported that choice. Property owners have the right to abate a trespass. If someone builds something on your land without permission, you can remove it. You don't need a court order. You don't need the trespasser's agreement. You simply need to act reasonably and without unnecessary destruction. Filling in an unauthorized pond qualifies as reasonable. Hiring professionals to do it properly qualifies as prudent. The HOA's potential liability extended beyond the trespass itself. They could be held responsible for the cost of restoration. Every dollar spent on excavators, fill dirt, grading, and reseeding. They could face claims for diminished property value if the excavation damaged drainage patterns or soil stability. If the pond work had damaged underground utilities, irrigation systems, or landscaping, those costs would fall on the association as well. More significantly, the HOA's actions could constitute waste of association funds. Homeowner dues are collected for legitimate, common area maintenance and improvements. Spending those funds on construction that occurs on private property, construction that the owner immediately reverses, represents a misuse of collective resources. Members could potentially challenge the expenditure and demand accountability from the board members who authorized it. The legal principle here is simple. Your property line is a boundary that others cross at their peril. HOAs operate under specific grants of authority, usually defined in CC and RS, bylaws, and state statutes. Those grants are limited. They typically include maintenance of common areas, enforcement of architectural guidelines, and management of shared amenities. They do not include the right to commandeer private lots for association projects. Even if the HOA genuinely believed the land was part of the common area, proper procedure required verification before construction. Survey the boundaries. Review the plat maps. Consult the title documents. If there's any question about ownership, resolve it through proper channels before sending in the excavators. The failure to take these basic steps left the association legally exposed and financially liable. The property owner's swift action eliminated the possibility of more complicated legal theories. Had the pond remained for months or years, the HOA might have attempted to claim prescriptive easement or adverse possession, though both would face significant hurdles. By restoring the property immediately, the owner ensured no ambiguity could develop about their intent to exclude the HOA from their land. The message was legally sound and practically devastating. This property has an owner, and that owner will enforce their rights. The invoice arrived 3 weeks after the pond disappeared. Certified mail, return receipt requested, as if the formality of the delivery method might somehow legitimize what it contained. The HOA treasurer had itemized every expense: excavation contractor fees, landscape design consultation, decorative stone border materials, aquatic plant starter kit, pond liner installation, labor surcharges for weekend work. The total came to just under $19,000. $19,000 of homeowner dues, spent without a single vote, dug into property that didn't belong to the association. The board meeting minutes told the rest of the story. Someone had proposed a community enhancement initiative back in February. The motion passed 4-1, with the sole dissenting vote buried in a footnote about fiscal responsibility concerns. No survey was commissioned. No property records were consulted. The project manager had apparently walked the neighborhood, pointed at an empty lot that looked like it could use something, and received approval to proceed. That empty lot happened to have a deed, a property tax bill, and an owner who simply didn't live there full time. The waste extended beyond the immediate construction costs. The HOA's insurance premium would increase next cycle because the incident had been reported as a potential liability claim. The board had already spent 4 billable hours with their attorney, trying to determine if they could compel restoration of community improvements. That legal consultation alone cost $1,200 to conclude what any reasonable person could have determined for free. You can't force someone to keep a pond they never authorized on land they legally own. Then there was the political cost. Harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The quarterly assessment notice went out the week after the pond vanished, and for the first time in the community's history, a significant number of homeowners showed up to the budget meeting demanding answers. How had this happened? Who approved it? Why wasn't there a verification process? What other projects might be equally poorly vetted? The board president resigned at that meeting. The treasurer followed 2 weeks later. The property manager who'd recommended the original contractor quietly stopped returning calls and was replaced by month's end. All of it, the money, the leadership vacuum, the community discord, traceable to a single decision made without proper diligence. The assumption that authority extended wherever convenience suggested it might. The belief that good intentions could substitute for basic verification. Some board members tried to reframe the narrative. They'd been trying to improve property values. They'd been responding to complaints about underutilized space. they'd been acting in the community's best interest. But the financial statements didn't care about intentions. The wasted resources remained wasted regardless of motivation. The replacement board implemented new protocols within 60 days. Any project exceeding $5,000 now required a professional survey if it came within 50 feet of a property line. Any work on what might be private property required written consent from the deed holder, notarized and filed with the association records. The project approval process added 2 additional checkpoints and a mandatory comment period. All sensible measures, all things that should have been standard practice from the beginning. The $19,000 couldn't be recovered. The pond contractor had been paid in full before anyone questioned the location. The decorative stones had been delivered and installed. The plants had been purchased from a specialty nursery with a no-return policy. Even if the board had wanted to sue for recovery, their own meeting minutes documented their approval of every expenditure. The money was simply gone, converted into a hole that existed for less than a week before being filled back in, leaving nothing behind but expensive lessons about the difference between authority and permission. The excavators had been gone for 3 days when the first letter arrived. Not from the HOA, they'd gone conspicuously silent, but from 2 neighbors on the same street who'd watched the entire sequence unfold. Both wanted to know exactly what survey company had been used and whether the property owner would be willing to share the documentation process. One admitted they'd been arguing with the HOA for 18 months about a fence line. The other mentioned a drainage project that had crept 6 feet onto their lot. The requests kept coming. What became clear was that the pond incident hadn't been an isolated miscalculation. It had been a symptom of something larger. An HOA board that had spent years operating on assumptions rather than surveys, on convenience rather than consent, on the principle that asking forgiveness was easier than asking permission. Until someone made forgiveness impossible. The property owner spent the following week creating a file that would prevent this from ever happening again. The first document was a formal letter to the HOA management company, not the board, but the professional entity contracted to handle administration. It included a complete survey of the property with boundaries marked in red, a timeline of the unauthorized excavation with dated photographs, and a clear statement that any future entry onto the property without written permission would be treated as criminal trespass and referred to local authorities immediately. The letter requested written confirmation of receipt and acknowledgement. It arrived within 48 hours. The second step was less formal, but more permanent. Small survey markers were installed at each corner of the property, the kind used by professionals, bright orange caps on steel posts driven 2 feet into the ground. They weren't decorative, they weren't subtle, they were visible from the street and unmistakable in their purpose. The message was simple. These lines are not negotiable. The third step involved the county. A copy of the survey, along with photographs of the property in its current state, was filed with the local land records office. If anyone ever tried to claim the pond had been there for years, or that the property lines were ambiguous, or that there had been some kind of implied easement, the record would show otherwise. The documentation was time-stamped, notarized, and a matter of public record. What surprised the property owner most was how many people didn't know they could do this. The neighbors who'd reached out had assumed that fighting an HOA required lawyers, arbitration, months of procedural warfare. They hadn't considered that property rights were older than HOA covenants, that trespass law didn't care about architectural review committees, that sometimes the fastest route to resolution was simply refusing to let the problem exist. One of those neighbors hired the same survey company the following month. Another installed cameras along their fence line, not for security, but for documentation. A third requested a formal review of all HOA projects from the past 5 years, cross-referencing them against recorded property plats. The board, which had operated for years, in the comfortable assumption that most homeowners wouldn't push back, suddenly found itself dealing with owners who had receipts, surveys, and a clear understanding of where common areas ended and private property began. The pond site itself had been seeded with grass. In a few months, it would be indistinguishable from the rest of the lawn. But the principle it represented wouldn't fade. The property owner had learned something that would outlast the landscaping: that the most effective way to protect your property from future intrusions wasn't to build higher fences or write angrier letters. It was to make the cost of assumption higher than the cost of asking permission. To make the consequences immediate, visible, and impossible to ignore. The HOA never dug another pond.